Live from Los Angeles, here's Eliot Stein.
Good evening on the internet worldwide. Eliot Stein with you for the next 90 minutes here on Stein Online from CompuServe Interactive Radio and Yahoo Broadcast. Hello, thank you for joining me. We have quite a show for you today. It is 10 years now since that wall of oppression, the Berlin Wall, came tumbling down. We're going to talk to two wonderful individuals who know everything about it. Joining us later in the show at the halfway point, we'll be joined by Jonathan Greenwald, who was the political consular at the U.S. Embassy in East Berlin from 1987 through 1990, so he was right there and actually involved in the events that led up to the removal of the Berlin Wall. Joining us in our first 45 minutes today is John Marx, the former bureau chief in Berlin for U.S. News and World Report and the author of an historical fiction account called The Wall. And he was there as well and saw it all and knows it all. Let us go now to our first guest, John Marx, the author of The Wall, former bureau chief in Berlin for the U.S. News and World Report. Hello, John.
Hello, Elliot. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been looking forward to doing this program as we take a look at how that wall came tumbling down. When did you become the bureau chief in Berlin, or maybe you were something else, another position there beforehand? Tell us about your involvement in being a correspondent journalist in Berlin.
Well, first I want to correct one thing. I actually got to Berlin in 1990, several months after the fall of the wall.
Okay.
But I started out as a freelancer for U.S. News in 1990 before German unification, which followed about 9 months after the wall fell. And then I became Berlin bureau chief in 1992 and remained in that position until 1995.
Very, very good. Thanks for clarifying that. Well, obviously you had the opportunity to meet all kinds of people, everybody from West Berliners to East Berliners, and hear their stories and be able to listen to details of what happened and why it happened.
That's right.
Is there any time in your life that you were fascinated? How did you wind up in Berlin? Was there anything that got you there from personal desire to want to cover this area?
Well, actually, that's exactly what happened. It was a matter of personal desire and inclination. I had been a student in West Germany in 1983 and 1984 at what was then called one of the Red Universities in Marburg, West Germany, which had 30% of the student body were members of the Communist Party, and it was highly activist and highly anti-American. And during that year, I traveled to East Germany and went to Leipzig and other East German cities, and also to the Soviet Union. And I learned to speak German and read German fluently, and I became absolutely fascinated not only with the language and the literature, but with that entire world. And so when the wall fell in 1989, I knew that I had to get back in some way or other to be at the center of all this. And in the meantime, I'd also begun to read a lot of historical accounts of Central and Eastern Europe, literature, from dissident literature, not only from East Germany, but from Czechoslovakia and Poland. And so basically I packed my bags in mid-1990 and went over to Berlin without a job and just started freelancing. And so I was also, when the wall fell in 1989, for me, who born in 1963, still a very small kid during the Vietnam War and all the events of the 60s and the early 70s, Watergate, this was one of the first world historical events that I had ever seen with my own eyes, I was filled with awe. It took my breath away. I don't know quite how to say it, but I was so compelled by what I'd seen and so much wanted to understand what it meant and how it had happened that I got over there as fast as I could.
Well, see, you're being too humble here, John. You were there even in the 80s. This is all, it's not like, oh, gee, I just went over there in 1990. You were living there in the area. You already had been involved in everything you described, so there's a lot more to this. Yes, you go back quite a while. You were there during the times when it was still a communist or socialist paradise, as they like to call it over there.
That's right.
And so we're getting a lot of great information from our first guest. John Marx joins us as we talk about the wall. You have written an historical fiction account where you're able to create characters in a story, in an espionage story involving the fall of the wall, and you're able to put in, of course, information that you know firsthand.
Right. I had thought for a while, particularly in the early 90s, as I learned more and more. Everyone I met, first I should say that as soon as I got to Berlin, I started asking everyone I met who had been there during the days when the wall fell, during that period, what they were doing, what they had seen, how they had experienced. Eastern Berliner, Western Berliner, American, Turk, whoever I could find in that city, I asked. And each story had a new little twist to it. Each person had a different account of where they had been, whether they'd actually heard the news, whether they had believed it or whether they hadn't. And I decided, and I started thinking about what a drama this was. And not only was it a drama that began and ended in Berlin, it actually started in Berlin and then it sort of raced through East Central Europe all the way to Romania. And I felt that the way to best capture this, or the way that I felt compelled to capture it, was in the form of a novel where I could take characters of my own devising based upon people I knew and had talked to, and sort of vicariously relive what it would have been like to have been, say, a member of the intelligence community suddenly faced with this world turning upside down. No longer any rules, or no longer any obvious rules to play by, no longer any ground beneath your feet that you can trust. It just seemed to me such rich material for fiction.
What I want to do, and I think I need to do, is I need to first establish some basic history.
Okay.
Because we have lots of folks that certainly know about the wall, but we've got lots of new listeners, those that, well, I've heard about the Berlin Wall, or I saw it come down, but I was young when it came down, and I don't know anything about it. So I'm going to give people just a basic 101 understanding here, and if you think I've missed anything, just jump in, John.
Okay, I'll do it.
I want the folks out there to picture this. Picture, after World War II, Germany being divided up into Western Germany and Eastern Germany. Think of essentially two countries. You've got Western, which is a democracy, like the United States, capitalism, free economy. People have all the same kind of free liberties and rights they have in the United States. Then think about Eastern Germany, everybody right next to it. Here's a full country that, although they are claiming they are their own sovereign nation, they're being essentially controlled by the Soviet Union. It's a puppet government of the Soviet Union, but it is a socialistic government that controls everything. It's communist, it's socialist, it's all those things in one, but they control the economy, they control the education, they control, you go to the store, there's one brand of milk if you're lucky enough to even get any, and they control that. It is essentially a complete communist nation where there are no freedoms at all. Now, inside East Berlin, and I know you're all picturing that out there. You got two countries after World War II, West Germany and East Germany. Inside East Germany, right in the center, in the heart of East Germany, think about a town called Berlin. And imagine this if you can, because it's like, what? For those hearing about it for the first time, they're going, what? Are you kidding? Think about a town, 3/4 of it having given to the Allies, actually the whole thing given to the Allies. Berlin divided up after World War II, given to the Allies, except 3/4 of it, the English, the UK, and the American and the French sector, becoming a democracy, just like the United States, a little democracy. And 1/4 of that Berlin becoming East Berlin, a communist nation. So what do you have? You've essentially got, in the middle of a country, you got a communist socialistic country, and sitting in the middle of it is half of a city that is a democracy. Now, I know that's hard to fathom. It's probably one of the few examples of anything like this in the history of the world. You've got a situation where people in that East Berlin part are saying, well, look, here's democracy. We can just take a little walk over here to West Berlin, and people have got free radio and free TV, and they've got all the products you can possibly imagine from all over the world. It's a free economy. You got nightlife. You can do whatever you want. And then over here in East Berlin, we've got this totalitarian government that is controlling us. Well, many of the people in East Berlin said, well, we don't want to stay here anymore, which is totally understandable. And Many of those people, though, they were loyal. They grew up in East. This is the area that their families lived before them, and they wanted to stay there. And many of them would go over to West Berlin and work, and come back to East Berlin at night. And then many of them would go shopping over there. Well, one night in August of 1961, the East Berliners woke up to a surprise on August 12th, a wall. Actually, the first wall was built of barbed wire and temporary blocks. It was replaced later by the concrete known as the Berlin Wall. Usually, I've heard everything from 15 to 20 feet high, but hopefully our guest can give us the exact measurements on it. And suddenly, the East Berliners found they could not go over to West Berlin and enjoy democracy. They couldn't even go shopping over there. Okay, do you want to throw anything on there, John? It's such a bizarre thing to explain that you've got this democracy sitting in the middle of a communist country.
Well, that's true, and in addition to that, to make it even stranger, West Berlin was not particularly popular to West Germans because economically it was a strange little place. There was some industry there, and there were a few things going on economically, but by and large, most large businesses, most of the promising businesses moved on to West Germany. So you had a depopulation problem inside this island. And in order to lure people there, for instance, young people, there were certain special laws for West Berlin. For instance, if you moved to West Berlin, you were not subject to the draft. It was relatively easy to find the place to live. West Berliners developed, and the thing about this was West Berlin became a kind of, it became a refuge for young people in West Germany. It had a particularly activist and radical student body. It was an artist's paradise. And all of this, when it was surrounded by hundreds and thousands of Soviet troops and East German troops, and defended by thousands of Allied troops, who, among them Americans, who had the understanding that if an invasion came, if in fact it came to war, they would almost certainly be swept away. They would almost certainly have to sacrifice their lives or be taken prisoner. So it was an absolutely bizarre and strange situation, and the importance of it can be measured by the fact that John F. Kennedy went to Berlin and declared, "I am a Berliner," to let people in West Berlin know, we are with you. The world is watching. You will not be secreted away in the middle of the night by the communist side.
In trying to come up with a situation that is parallel with the idea of a little democracy in the middle of a communist country, the only thing I can think of is the fact that we have, and most people don't know this, over in Cuba, we have an American naval base. Right. And people go, what are you talking about? We're not on Cuba. We have no Americans in Cuba. Yeah, well, we do. Over on the far eastern end of Cuba, we have an American naval base. We pay Castro every year. The United States government sends him a lease. We have a lease that goes back many years, and our government sends him a check for $200 as part of the lease, and he tears it up and sends it back. Every single year. But we actually have a little naval base on Cuba. But this is an odd situation. So here's a democracy. So naturally, East Berliners who don't have anything, and I want you, if you would now, because even in the 80s, you can give people a picture of the stark contrast between West Berlin and East Berlin. Try to give people the scenario of what it was like being in West Berlin, going over to East Berlin, and how the whole society changed. Everything from what was available in stores to the way people acted to obvious secret police being around. Please give us that idea, if you would, John.
Well, in West Berlin, when you arrived, and if you arrived, for instance, by train, you couldn't see much out the windows. Your compartment had been searched by dogs and fairly grim-looking border police as you cross over into East Germany. Mm-hmm. By the time you get to West Berlin, you've already had a taste of the system, and then you get out and suddenly, say you come in at Zoo Station, there is neon bright lights everywhere. It was a city that was reputed to never go to sleep, like New York City. There is, any whatever you want in the windows. You can get everything from whatever publications from around the world, or there are vegetable stands, fruit stands, all manner of vice to be had in West Berlin. Wonderful restaurants. You see military people walking around here and there. You see hippies, or what used to be called hippies anyway. Buskers playing music on the steps of the Memorial Church there near the train station. Movies of all different kinds, some with subtitles, some in the original version. It's basically a vibrant, modern city full of young people, many of them sitting out in cafes, with lots of old buildings, but a sense of life within them. The war is still partially visible. For instance, the Memorial Church that I just mentioned was left to stand as it was, as a wreck, so that when you get to West Berlin, you immediately have a remembrance of what had happened there. You say you decide you want to go to East Berlin. Say first you want to go and look over the wall. There were observation platforms, so that as you get away from that train station area and from that central part of the city, you get up close and you see the wall, and you climb up the platform, and over there you suddenly see a whole different world. You don't really see East Berlin yet. What you see is, say, the Brandenburg Gate. In the middle of this, what was called the Death Strip, you see guard towers, you see barbed wire, you see guards watching on the east side over to the west. If you want to go to the east side, you go to the central crossing point was at Friedrichstrasse, and you had to go over and state how much money you had, state your intentions, the purpose of your visit. Some people I know were strip searched on their way over. That didn't happen to me. And all of a sudden you get through and you are inside a shadow.
It's like 1984 all of a sudden.
There is no light if it's dark, and even if it's light, on those gray, overcast Berlin days, there's an eternal gloom that hangs over everything, a grayness. There are no neon lights to speak of. It's very hard to find any place decent to eat. If you do find some place decent to eat, and there were a couple of places, you will spend very little money. And in fact, you'll have a hard time spending your money because there's so little to spend it on. You will find that if you walk in certain neighborhoods, or if you rouse unwelcome interest from a police on the street or someone who looks like they could be a civilian, you may be followed. You may be questioned. You may run into locals who would enjoy talking to you about this or that, who might want to take you back to their apartment or sit in a cafe with you, but they will be very nervous. Perhaps it will happen, or perhaps they'll simply say, we can't do it, it's too dangerous. Often people would end up giving away the rest of their money to the people they ran into because they simply could not spend it. Also, East Berlin, unlike West Berlin, had not been cleaned up that much since the end of the war. There were new buildings, certainly, but they had buildings that had gone up in the midst of older structures like the train trestles or buildings that were still pockmarked with bullets from the Battle for Berlin, and places that were still looked as if they were still rubble from during the war. East Berlin was just so badly taken care of, and even if they had at one time, buildings had at one time been painted, the paint had begun to peel off, and there was just a wretched, dilapidated quality to the entire place. So that at the same time, you could meet wonderfully friendly people who would be glad to show you around and who would take you in, and but it was a place that was full of dread and fear, and in which there was not a lot to do unless you knew people over there already or had some specific goal in mind.
Let me come up with a metaphor or an analogy, whether it's good or not. I'll let you folks decide. It sounds like we're running the movie The Wizard of Oz backwards, that you're going from the place where Dorothy, it's all in color with beautiful things to do and funny people and just it's vibrant and musical and colorful, and you're going back to the part where it becomes black and white, where it's very sterile and there's nothing but dark clouds overhead. That's what it sounds like when you're going over from West Berlin over to East Berlin.
And I would add one thing to that, and that is that the Easterners could see the Technicolor. They could see it on their television sets. There were black markets. They could get Western albums, music albums. They could get bits and pieces of this and see it and almost taste it. They were so close. So part of the strangeness was it wasn't as if there was a clear separation. So many of the Eastern Germans and Eastern Berliners you met knew about what was going on in the West or had some idea about it. They would get packages from their Western German families or friends. So that was a part of this. The East German government was never successful in shielding its citizens from the color and brightness and vibrancy of the Western culture.
Well, I hope between you and I that we explain this, give people an idea, because as you said, first, in order to even get to East Berlin, if you're coming, say, from Germany, regular West Germany, you've got to cross first into East Germany.
Right.
And you said they're doing all kinds of searches at that point, and they're treating people already in a manner that only tyrannies do. And then you wind up in West Berlin, and things change again to a democracy. And then if you want to go visit over in East Berlin, once again, it turns back, the clock turns back to the Stone Age and of course when I said 1984 before, folks, I wasn't talking about the year, I was talking about the George Orwell novel. If you think about in terms of that, that's what East Germany, East Berlin was like. We're talking right now with John Marx. He's the author of The Wall. He's a former bureau chief in Berlin for U.S. News and World Report, and his book is an historical fiction in which he takes actual facts but also characters he's created and comes up with a wonderful spy story having to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let's pull up some questions for you because some people got some already for you. And the first one is, did you feel threatened when you were in East Berlin?
I did not feel threatened there. Where I felt the heavy hand of the system was in a city called Erfurt in southwestern East Germany back then. I was there on a student trip with a group of people my age, all Americans, and we were staying in a youth hostel with another group who were East Germans, and these were young, very young, say 10-year-old East German kids who were being watched over by a teacher. And one evening, some of the people in our group were talking with these little kids and teaching them some English phrases. They were very careful, as I remember, not to teach them anything jingoistic or anything that would get them into trouble. So they would teach them to say things like, "I am a great guy." That's the phrase that I remember in particular. "I am a great guy." The teacher, later that night, came to our rooms, knocked on our door in tears, and begged us not to have another thing to do with those children because the head of the youth hostel was affiliated with the secret police, and he told her that he would denounce her if she allowed the children to have one more conversation with us. That was the most vivid encounter that I had with the system, and that happened on the same day that we had gone into Erfurt and had a couple of East German economic functionaries answer all our questions about the challenges of a socialist economy by saying, "We don't have any real problems or challenges here because this is a socialist paradise." So,
well, your story there certainly illustrates the kind of repression, oppression, paranoia that took forth in East Berlin during the years that the wall was in existence, that just teaching some little kids some fun little American phrases in English, that this woman was concerned that she could lose her job.
Right.
Well, there's many stories, and let's pull up another question for you, and then we'll get into more areas, and we want to hear certainly about your book. Somebody wants to know about the Berlin Airlift. Now, there's going to be people who go, what is the Berlin Airlift? Right. So would you please explain that?
Sure. The Cold War arguably began in the late 40s, around 1948. The Berlin Airlift may be understood as the opening shot of the Cold War. Essentially, there were fair and free elections one time in Berlin under the occupation, and that was in 1946. And in those elections, the communists did fairly well, but it looked as if the city was going to become a democratic city, 100%. At the same time, relations between Joseph Stalin, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, and the heads of the Allied governments were beginning to sour as it became clear that Stalin had no intention of, say, withdrawing from this country or playing fair with the elections in some of the countries that his troops had occupied. As a result, as negotiations over the occupation broke down, Stalin basically said he was going to shut down Berlin, and he was not going to allow the city to continue to be ruled by the Western Democratic government that looked like it would ultimately run the communists out of town. So he cordoned off the entire city and was going to attempt to essentially starve it into submission, when the Allies responded by sending planes over the city and dropping all kinds of goods, food. There was one plane that was called the Candy Bomber that would drop candy and raisins and things to the kids. This blockade failed, and it has become a part of the legend. It became a part of the legend of West Berlin, and may have been one of the first moments in forging the idea of a West Berlin as opposed to an East Berlin, because the Allies were willing to protect this city from being overthrown or subjugated under a Soviet occupation. And the citizens of West Berlin immediately saw the implications of this and understood, really perhaps for the first time, that they were surrounded. So it was a very important incident. And from that moment on, I think it was also clear, just institutionally, that the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were no longer seeing eye to eye about the occupation of Germany.
When the blockade happened, essentially, it was a test. And the test was the Soviet Union, which I mentioned earlier, was controlling East Germany and East Berlin, saying, hey, look, what are they going to do? They've got this city in the middle of West Berlin, the democracy. A little tiny city is sitting in the middle of a huge country called East Germany. What are they going to do if we just simply stop all sources of food coming in, so the people have a choice of either starving to death, and we stop anything that they need? What if we blockade all of their needs? What are they going to do? Well, they took the chance and said maybe the Americans and the other allies who might be interested will say, this isn't worth it.
Right.
This just simply isn't worth it. We can't protect this little tiny area called West Berlin, sitting in the middle of a huge country called East Germany. There would be too much involved to do so. There'd be too much manpower. There would be we would be using resources we would need to use elsewhere. And they tested it, and they found out that the Americans and the other nations that were part of this said, no, you cannot do this. This is a democracy. It's going to stay a democracy, even if it is in your territory. And so we brought in our own supplies and dropped them on the city, and they eventually backed down.
And it lasted for months. It
Yes.
was quite an endeavor. I mean, it was a real risk, and that the Allies took. They also took a risk in a sense. They risked that this would not lead to war. They sort of felt, I think, that Stalin was in a sense bluffing himself. Mm-hmm. And so it's just a fascinating chapter, and it kind of it's sort of the first leg on the way to the wall going up.
Tell me probably the most astonishing, compelling story that you ever heard from an East Berliner that managed to get out of East Berlin and get into West Berlin. And I'm, of course, talking about not by walking over the border. I'm talking about by taking a hot air balloon, or by some of the most innovative and intricate means that were employed by these people. Said, we don't want to live here anymore. We want to live in West Berlin. What story that just comes to your mind?
Well, the one that I remember most vividly has to do with a Trabant, an East German car that, is this right? No, it wasn't a Trabant.
It was a Volkswagen.
It was a Volkswagen. And a secret compartment was built within this Volkswagen for the person to hide behind when they crossed the border. And dogs sniffed at it, and mirrors were placed under it, and there was clear suspicion that something was going on, but nothing could be found. This compartment was absolutely tiny. It was impossible to believe that someone had actually crawled into this, what amounted to a tiny crawl space. And in order to pull this off, they had to stay in there for several hours. And that's one that comes to mind. That car, or a piece of the car, the compartment, was in a museum in Berlin in the early 90s. I don't know if it's still there.
It was two young people in love.
Right.
A guy and a girl, and I forgot it was the girl that came to get the guy, or the guy that came to get the girl, but one of them was risking their lives on a compartment that wasn't... Look, a Volkswagen hardly has room for the regular passenger by itself. To think about hiding a compartment and somebody in it in a Volkswagen is incredulous. and they did it, and that person was in there, and they could have suffocated, and they managed to get across to the west. It was quite a story.
I know there was also that famous story, I think it was made into a movie, about the people who made their own hot air balloon and managed to float over, and the wind took them far enough to land on the right side, but I think along the way, maybe they came down on the wrong side before they actually got over. But of course, there are all these stories, and then there are the much sadder stories about the people who were shot trying to make it over. And there were hundreds and hundreds of these people, not only between the two Berlins, but people trying to cross from East Germany to West Germany along the border between the two countries.
Right.
And over 1,000 people died trying to get out of that country.
Because the one thing that people may not realize, the wall was not only there to stop East Berliners getting over to West Berlin, but in order to stop, here you've got East Germany surrounds West Berlin, so they actually had to build a wall that went over 100 miles all the way around the perimeter of East Germany as well.
That's right.
Because in order to stop people wanting to go in from there, and I don't know the exact number, but I've heard numbers that are possibly 1,000 murdered by the East German regime.
Well, trying to get across, I think it's slightly over 1,000. There were landmines on the East German side, and in fact, after the wall came down, there were people still being killed by those landmines. I don't know if they should really reasonably be included in the number, but there were people. There were barbed wire. There were guard dogs. There were border guards with orders to shoot, some of whom have been since tried and convicted for doing this. One of the ironies, really, of the post-Cold War era is that a lot of the small fry have been tried and convicted for murdering people at the border, having acted on the orders of superiors who, particularly Erich Honecker, the premier of the East German government, who got away without, they were going to try him, but he managed to get out of the country and essentially died a free man.
Well, it's quite a story. Now, if you would tell us about your book, John, tell us about The Wall and what it's about, and give us an idea why we would like it.
My novel is about an American intelligence officer who, at the very worst possible moment of the Cold War, at the very last minute, decides to defect to the wrong side. In other words, he decides to defect to the communist side just hours before the wall falls, making the whole idea of defection, in a sense, moot. And he decides to do this. His decision to do this affects not only him, but everyone around him, all the people who love him and care about him and who are associated with him. And as the wall then falls, the East German government falls, there are mass demonstrations. The story then goes on to Prague, where revolutions take place there, and then on to Romania, where yet another revolution takes place. And basically, I was fascinated by the idea of a moment in time when people live right up to the last minute, believing in the world existing a certain way, acting upon certain fundamental principles, like there is an East and there is a West. There are two enemy sides, and one knows which side is which, and if one doesn't like the one side, they can go over to the other side. And then all of a sudden, very quickly, without intelligence people, journalists, academics, military people able to predict it or even understanding what's happening while it's happening, all of that changes. The world truly, in a matter of months at that point, underwent a massive upheaval, after which nothing in that part of the world was the same again. And what would it mean for people who had staked everything on the status quo before that? What would it mean if all of a sudden they had to react and cope with a new world? Trying to understand it as the rest of the world is understanding it, but having their lives depending upon making the right choices and making the right decisions. So that's what the novel is about, and it takes its backdrop are the revolutions that keep occurring in these countries against expectations. Each time, the people in the book believe that, for instance, Romania, there won't be a revolution because it's far too repressive. Ceausescu, the premier, will understand what's going on and he'll clamp down on it. But no, there too he falls, and so much unexpected happening. I wanted to. So my individuals, then my spy and his loved ones, his brother, his girlfriend, his best friend, all try to basically get a hold of him and track him down in order to save themselves. that's the story.
A few minutes left here with John Marx, the author of The Wall, former bureau chief in Berlin for U.S. News and World Report, and as you heard, a gentleman whose life, it seems, ran parallel with Berlin for many years. His interest in Germany and the eastern part, and it goes back to the 80s, and he's written a fascinating story now, historical fiction, including, of course, real live events leading up to the wall going down. Tell us any real special story that you have that you want to share with us here for your last few minutes.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the interesting stories I heard, and I heard this repeatedly, had to do with the East Germans themselves and the way they were thinking when the wall fell. We have a very vivid image of East Germans celebrating the wall coming down and dancing on the wall and walking over with tears in their eyes, just unable to believe what had happened. But then in later years, it took a couple of years before they realized that they had also given up a country, they'd given up a way of life, and this was something they hadn't anticipated, or many of them hadn't anticipated feeling or having to think about. I remember one East German friend of mine told me that he and his family in early 1989 had been invited to go to Romania to visit some friends. And they had been not been dissidents, but they had been opposed to the East German system. They had no love for it whatsoever. They hated the government. They went to Romania, and they were treated immediately much worse than they'd been treated in their own country. The people that they went to visit told them when they got off the plane that they had to get back on the plane because in the meantime the invitation had been outlawed by the government. No foreigners could come into Romania at that moment. They managed to go ahead and get off the plane and go to their friend's house, but because there were no foreigners allowed in Romania, they weren't allowed to say a word because the apartment was tapped. The family then said, let's go up into the mountains. We have a place that isn't tapped. And in order to get food, they had to dig potatoes out of the ground. And by the time they got back to East Germany, they'd suddenly decided, you know what? This isn't such a bad country after all. Maybe there are things that we can make work here. And within a few months after that, it was all gone. There were many stories like that. As much as that government was hated, and it was, I heard again and again from people, and this was during the years of disillusionment that followed the fall of the wall, talk about going even to West Germany and being told by relatives, what's wrong with you people? Why can't you get it right? Are you idiots? Why haven't you got rid of this government long ago? Coming back to East Germany and thinking, maybe the West Germans aren't as great as I'd thought before. Maybe it's not all wonderful goods and services and all the food you can eat and all that. Maybe there are other sides to it that aren't so great. And then one way or the other, on November 9th, 1989, it's gone. It's completely washed away. And people it's not washed away on November 9th, but within a year, East Germany ceases to exist and becomes a part of Germany. And the sequel is a massive new country in the heart of Europe with lots of Eastern Germans who, as if by magic, suddenly find themselves in a new country and don't quite know how they got there. And those stories fascinate me because of the euphoria of the moment when the wall fell, because of all the joy and the wonder of it.
Now, since you go back to the 80s in traveling through both West Germany and East Germany and the Berlins and studying it and being involved and a part of it, did you have any inclination to believe or any reason to believe that this thing would come down? Did you think that, no, there's just no way? Or did you think, I'm starting to see a situation where the people are going to eventually revolt and just economic pressures will bring it down? What was there any point that you felt yourself, yes, there's a chance this could happen?
No, I did not. In fact, I remember specifically being asked on a train by an older West German, did I ever think Germany would be reunified? And I just said, no way. That's just pie in the sky. I certainly didn't think. It might have occurred to me that the wall was so absurd that one day it would come down, but I never imagined it would come down this quickly. In a word, no. It seemed so firm. It seemed so much a part of the landscape. It seemed so accepted. And yes, it was clear that East Germans were unhappy, just as it was clear that many Eastern Europeans were unhappy. But I don't think anyone anticipated the speed, the depth of the unhappiness, or the corruption of the governments. And the minute that Mikhail Gorbachev essentially told the world, I will not stop these countries from moving towards democracy if that's what the people want. And he did that the year in 1988, around December. At that point, to an extent that I don't think anyone in the West understood, the regimes in Eastern Europe had been fatally undermined. And the people in those countries, particularly the distant communities, I think they understood that. But I'm not sure even they knew that people would rise up by the tens of thousands, and in the case of East Germany, without a shot being fired, overthrow governments and find nothing whatsoever in them worth saving or salvaging. So no, I did not see it coming.
Now, if your book is made into a movie, if The Wall, which has gotten a lot of publicity, and certainly I'm sure Hollywood is aware of it, if it was to be made into a movie and they said, well, look, let's film this thing on location, do you think if they actually had to build pieces of the wall up again to film a movie, do you think people would be throwing eggs at it? What do you think the reaction would be?
Oh, right now, particularly in Berlin, I think that people would get a big kick out of it, and it might actually spark some thinking about what it all means. I mean, one of the stranger aspects of Berlin in the years following the fall of the wall is that the traces of the old system disappeared very quickly. There was a big gap in the middle of the city, but the wall was gone. And so if that were to happen, if it were to be made into a movie and they were to rebuild, say, the wall, I think it might actually turn in, Berlin being this bohemian sort of arts-oriented city, it might actually turn into a kind of performance art where people would come up and write things on the wall and would really enjoy it, and it might spark a discussion that would be valuable. I mean, I could only hope that it would be my book that would do that, but I think that's the sort of the spirit of the place. I don't think anymore Eastern Germans no longer, I don't think, feel that the wall is such a palpable symbol of their oppression, particularly after 10 years of a very difficult transition to Western-style capitalism. I mean, they don't love the wall, but it's not quite the symbol it was.
Having joined us for the first half of Stein Online today, our special on the fall of the Berlin Wall, has been John Marx, the author of The Wall. Pick it up. It's at bookstores nationwide and at Amazon.com and also at BarnesandNoble.com. John, thank you so much for having joined us today.
Eliot, thanks for having me.
And now we continue with great guests and great talk. Here's Eliot.
And today is our special program as we look at the fall of the Berlin Wall 10 years ago. And now we are joined by Jonathan Greenwald. He was the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in East Berlin from 1987 through 1990. And he is also the author of a book called Berlin Witness, an American Diplomat's Chronicle of East Germany's Revolution. And we welcome you, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Eliot. I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, let us find out, if we can, a little bit about your background. How is it that you became a political counselor in our embassy in East Berlin? And how long did we have an embassy in East Berlin? When did that become official?
Well, the United States and the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, established diplomatic relations in late 1973. The embassy opened in 1974. So we had diplomatic relations and an embassy there until the wall fell and German unification came. So a total of 16 years.
Okay. And how is it that you wound up in that position? And did you have any particular interest to want to be involved in the ongoing situation with East Germany?
Well, it was the most fortunate occurrence of my life, and one that shows sometimes that things happen in very odd ways. The very first serious book that I ever read as not even a high school student, but a junior high school student, was a book called Berlin Diary by William Shirer, who was a CBS radio correspondent in Berlin in the 1930s, wrote a book which described his day-to-day experiences with the Hitler regime in the beginning of the Second World War. When I read that, I thought it would be wonderful someday to live abroad, to witness history as Shirer did. And that started my interest in international affairs, and it led me eventually into the Foreign Service after I graduated from college and law school. And the most remarkable thing was that I found myself with an opportunity to witness history as I'd hoped someday, but never dreamed that it would actually be in Berlin. and B, in fact, in the second tour I had in Berlin, because the very first tour I had abroad in the early 1970s was 4 years in West Berlin, where I met my wife while I was at the U.S. mission in West Berlin, which was part of the military occupation of the city. And then we had the opportunity to go back in 1987 when I was the head of the political section, as you said, at the embassy in East Berlin.
Well, you've got some amazing stories to tell, and we're going to hear some of them today, and they, of course, are all available in your book that is called Berlin Witness, an American Diplomat's Chronicle of East Germany's Revolution, and we'll tell people about that throughout the program today. Why would we have an embassy in East Berlin? Did we have one there for Americans that would be getting in trouble for some reason? Why would they be in East Berlin to begin with? Or did we have one in the hopes that we eventually could apply some kind of diplomatic pressure to East Germany to say, why don't you start loosening things up around here? Why did we have this? Because it seems odd, out of all places in the world, East Berlin, for us to have an embassy.
Well, no, it was quite natural and normal. We had an embassy in East Berlin for the same reason we have an embassy in London, Kuala Lumpur, in anywhere else where there is a country and a government with which one needs to do business. The GDR was an operating government, an operating state with many, many areas where its activities overlapped with American activities, sometimes against our interests, sometimes, in fact, concurrent with our interests. We have the same reasons to have diplomatic relations with it as with any other government. It took longer to establish them because of the special problems of the German situation. But once what was called Ostpolitik, the effort by the Willy Brandt government in West Germany beginning in 1969 to improve West German relations with Eastern Europe began, it became natural enough for the United States and for all of the United States' allies, and for in fact that matter, just about every country in the world, to establish an embassy in East Berlin, to have an East German embassy in our capital in Washington, and to conduct normal diplomatic business.
We always hear about our embassies, U.S. embassies in foreign countries, and how they try to help Americans get in trouble. And you go, well, I really doubt that Americans are going to get in much trouble in East Germany because they're probably not going to be over there for any reason.
Well, there were relatively few American tourists. There were, of course, a number of people who had relatives in East Germany who would visit them. There were academics who had fellowships, perhaps spending a year at an East German university. There were a certain number of tourists who would come. There were, in fact, a lot of tourists who would make day trips from West Berlin who, for one reason or another, would have the same kinds of problems that people have requiring consular assistance of any sort, from something as simple to losing a passport to having an automobile accident, needing somebody to visit them in the hospital, that kind of thing, which happens in normal life. And East Germany was no different in that respect than any other country.
Okay, well, you certainly have told us a lot of reasons why we had an embassy there to begin with. We're talking with Jonathan Greenwald. He was the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in East Berlin from 87 to 1990s. We talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall. When did you, because, I mean, you couldn't have asked for the most perfect years to be there, John. I mean, you were a witness to history. You really couldn't, if somebody was really interested in this area of the world, I mean, there you are, right there when it's all happening. But when did it start becoming apparent to you, yes, maybe something's happening here. Maybe they're finally untightening these controls that they've had over people and this repression that has gone on here since 1961. When did you first turn to a colleague and say, hey, something's going on?
Well, it wasn't to a colleague, it was to my wife, and I'll tell you that story, but let me go back just a little bit. I've described the consular reasons for having relationships with the GDR government and having an embassy. But of course, there were also some very important political reasons. The GDR was a quite important state in Europe, besides being the other half of the German equation. It was the single most important, strongest economically, and for that matter militarily, ally of the Soviet Union. We needed to have diplomatic relations with it to try to influence some of its policies, and through its policies influenced the Soviet Union.
Let me just jump in here and tell people that GDR stood for German Democratic Republic, even though it wasn't really so democratic. That's how they viewed themselves, at least.
Yeah, that was the official name, and rather than speak out the full long title, it was usually just broken down into those three initials.
Okay, so we now have our reference point for GDR. Go ahead.
And I was very interested in going back to Central Europe or to Eastern Europe as it came time to have my next assignment in 1987. I'd spent a couple of years in Budapest in Hungary just before that, before being in Washington for a couple of years. And I wanted to go back to Eastern Europe because it seemed to me it was the most exciting and interesting area of the world at that point. The Gorbachev impact was beginning to be felt in Eastern Europe as in the Soviet Union. One could see that change was coming, not the kind of change that we ultimately had, but it was clear that the ice flows were breaking up and that important things were happening. And it seemed like the most interesting work I could do would be to go somewhere in that area. Where I actually wanted to go, I didn't have Russian, and there was a long line of people who wanted to go to Moscow before me, so I knew I couldn't get to Moscow. Where I really wanted to go was Warsaw, because it seemed like that was the place where the action was and was most likely to get hottest. Solidarność, the movement that was started by Lech Walesa, was resuming its importance in Polish life. Martial law had given way to a very uneasy relationship between the government and the people, and it was clear that something big was going to happen in Poland quite soon. So I asked to go to Warsaw, and I was given that assignment to be the head of the political section at the embassy in Warsaw. And as I was about to start learning Polish and prepare myself for that, my wife came to me, and I should explain that my wife is a Berliner. I met her in that first tour in Berlin in the 1970s, and she said that for personal reasons, basically because of the illness of her mother, it would be a good thing if instead of going to Warsaw, we could go to East Berlin. And I agreed for family reasons that was important, and I went to the State Department and asked them if they would switch the assignment. And they were good enough to do that, and so they sent us to East Berlin, and I spent the first year or two there finding it an interesting assignment, but frankly saying to myself, gosh, well, this was the right thing to do for family reasons. I'm missing out on that history that I wanted to see, because Solidarność was indeed rising again. Poland was having a free election. It was having a round table to establish the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe. And it looked like East Germany was going to be the very last place where any events of that sort would happen. And gradually in the summer of 1989, it became apparent that tension was building for a number of reasons. And I still remember the evening in June at a cocktail party at the home of one of the other embassy officers, where an East German diplomat who I knew rather well from business acquaintances came up to me. We both had drinks in our hands, and we were outside, so we were beyond the normal range of the microphones that one would expect would be in the walls of an embassy house. And he said to me, and this was a few days after the Polish elections and after events had already begun to happen in Hungary of a similar magnitude. And he came up to me and he said, you know, you see what's happening in Poland and you see what's happening in Hungary. The same things are going to happen here in 2 years because we have exactly the same problems. And this was a shock to me because GDR diplomats were very disciplined. They were quite able, but they didn't talk loosely, and they didn't speak about problems that weren't already printed in the newspaper, and certainly didn't talk out of school. And I was rather shocked that he would speak so frankly. And it made me realize that the problems were perhaps even deeper and in some ways nearer the surface than we thought. And as that summer went on, there were more and more signs of trouble. There were thousands of East Germans who made efforts to cross the Hungarian border into Austria because the Hungarians had said they would no longer keep the barbed wire up at that border. There were many other East Germans who began to sit in at West German embassies, particularly in Prague, demanding that they be allowed to go to West Germany. Erich Honecker, the leader of the government, the party leader, was ill and was out of commission, and the government seemed to be paralyzed, unable to respond, and the pressure kept building up. And finally, shortly after our Labor Day in early September, there were the first reports of independent political activities, groups that were beginning to emerge and put out proclamations saying that there had to be some kind of dialogue between the people and the government. And I remember watching the first television broadcasts of those first reports one evening in early September, and turning to my wife, and she turned to me at the same time, and she said, maybe it wasn't such a bad thing for your career, for your opportunity to see a little bit of history, that we came here. And that was really the moment that crystallized for me that, in fact, something truly historic might be in the process of developing right in front of our eyes.
Well, it's an amazing story. And now, of course, I have to throw in a little charming comment. I guess when you met your wife, she was the second person you ever heard say, "Ich bin ein Berliner."
Well, if you want to get into German grammar, and my wife is always correcting my grammar, that famous Kennedy line,
yes.
Ich bin ein Berliner, means actually that you're a certain kind of cream puff that Berliners eat as a dessert. You're supposed to say, Ich bin Berliner. And I'd heard the version of the story I'd gotten from my first German teacher even before my wife, because when I started learning German, the woman who taught me at the Foreign Service Institute in Washington was the woman who had been deputized to teach President Kennedy how to speak a paragraph in German in that speech. And she went to have the final lesson with him on the day he was to fly off to Europe.
Yes.
And Kennedy was delayed and came out of the meeting late and said, "I'm sorry, I just don't have time to finish this session with you." So he went off without proper instruction, and as a result, he forgot 3/4 of the paragraph he was supposed to speak in German. He didn't pick up the grammatical point she had tried to teach him, and instead he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and went down in history with that line.
Well, the way the people were applauding, I guess they realized he's doing his best, and and I think they understood what he was trying to accomplish.
I think they did.
Absolutely. We are talking for another half an hour with Jonathan Greenwald. He was the political consular at the United States Embassy in East Berlin from 1987 through 1990. He has a book that you can find in bookstores. If you can't find it there, you can go to Amazon.com. It is called Berlin Witness, an American Diplomat's Chronicle of East Germany's Revolution. So not only was he a witness, he was part of what went on with the fall of the Berlin Wall. We'll take a few questions in just a few minutes from the audience. We'll squeeze a few of those in there on our special 90-minute edition of Stein Online with Eliot Stein here on CompuServe Interactive Radio. What kind of special privileges does a political consular, an ambassador from the United States have in East Berlin? Do they still, when you wanted to travel from east over to west, back and forth, and do things through, or do you get special accommodations under that arrangement? And otherwise, how is life different if you are a representative of the United States there?
Well, in some ways, it's like being a representative of the United States in any capital in any country. Diplomats are normally treated quite well. They're treated with respect by the host government. In certain ways, it was truly extraordinary in East Berlin because, of course, Berlin was a divided city, and for most people, it was very difficult to travel between east and west and east. It wasn't impossible, and in fact, one of the interesting things that not many Americans realize is that in the last couple of years of the GDR, travel was increasing greatly. Legally permissible travel of East Germans to West Germany it had increased to the point where several million East Germans were traveling in that last year before the wall fell. This was an effort to release some of the internal pressures that turned out probably to be counterproductive for the government because the people who traveled found that life, in fact, was better in the West. They came back to the East and found their own government still being totally recalcitrant about reforms, and it increased the degree of unhappiness. But travel was possible for many people, but it was quite difficult. You had to make applications well in advance. You could never be confident you would get permission. It was quite different for a diplomat. We had a pass that allowed us automatically, simply by showing the pass to the border control, to go through without any question and any kind of control at all. So it was a matter of a few seconds to go from one world into the other world. One of the things that we always try to do, by that I mean my wife and myself, was to live as much as possible, though, in East Berlin and East Germany. The great risk for any American diplomat abroad is to get trapped into a golden ghetto of fellow embassy people or other Western diplomats, or a small coterie that lives a life cut off from the country you're in. And that risk was increased in Berlin in some ways more than anywhere else, because you had that other world that was so different and so attractive just across the wall. And we had to guard against it doubly because we had so many friends from West Berlin from our previous years there, my wife's whole life, in fact. But we tried, in fact, to spend virtually all of our time making acquaintances, meeting people, traveling in East Germany, because the job of the political counselor, the best job at an embassy, really, is to learn everything he can about the country he's in so that he understands it as well as possible and can interpret that country back to his own government. And in turn, when he is asked by his government to interpret American positions to the government he's accredited to, he understands what it is that has a chance to be understood by them, what kind of arguments that may be appreciated, and ways to make as much understanding as possible come about between the two countries, the two governments. So we traveled as much as we could, had a great many acquaintances in East Germany, and in fact it was possible in East Germany to meet a lot of people and to get to know a lot of people. One tends to think, well, this is an autocratic, totalitarian society with a policeman in every corner and a microphone in every wall, and to some extent that was true. But a great many East Germans were very open to have acquaintances from the West. They wanted it. They were eager for it. It was a sign that things were, in fact, changing in East Germany. We'd only been a couple of months in East Berlin before we looked at each other and said, gosh, we've been invited into more homes in 3 months than we were in our whole tour in Hungary, which is supposed to be a much more open, liberal place. Partly that had to do with the fact that our German was much better than our Hungarian was, but partly it was the times that Gorbachev had produced a change in East Germany, and partly it was a fact that there were more possibilities. It was a little bit more of an open place than in those years than most people realized it was.
Okay, very good. Let's pull up some questions that people have for you. The first one is, John, where were you exactly? What were you doing when somebody told you, or you saw for yourself, they said, there's East Berliners up on top of the wall and the government's not doing anything?
Well, I'm slightly embarrassed about this, but I'll explain. It was clear that very, very major changes were happening in East Germany. They've been building for weeks after the fall of Honecker on the 18th of October, that is 3 weeks before the wall itself opened up. The new government was trying to catch up to what was in fact a speeding up revolution, and it was always a half day or a day behind events. And the week in which the wall opened up began with a huge demonstration of 500,000 people, perhaps as many as 1 million people, on Alexanderplatz in the heart of East Berlin, where every conceivable demand, except a demand for unification, was made, but a demand for free elections, for doing away with the party, and so on and so forth. And then in the first days of the week, you had a special congress of the ruling party, the ruling Communist Party, that was trying to reassemble a new leadership, trying to develop a new program, trying to get on the Gorbachev line of reform, trying to catch up to this revolution and gain control of it. And part of the effort to catch up with the revolution was a decision to change the travel laws so that it would become easy and predictable for East Germans to travel. In effect, to make the wall no longer very meaningful, because one would be able to go through it legally without any real difficulty. A draft travel law had been announced already that week. It was under revision in the first days of the week. So we all anticipated that it would be a rather short time before there would be, in fact, revolutionary travel between East Berlin and West Berlin. And on the second day of that party conference, we were watching on television in the embassy as one of the members of the ruling group of the Politburo, a man named Günter Schabowski, held a press conference to explain what had happened in the conference on that second day. Toward the end of the conference, last few minutes, in fact, he was asked a question about travel, and he gave a rather confused and garbled answer, which appeared to say that we have a new law already, we've decided on it, passed it today, and from tomorrow it will be possible for East Germans to travel freely. All they'll have to do is go to the police station, make an application for a passport, get a passport, and then with that they could cross anywhere into West Berlin or West Germany. And that was quite remarkable. People jumped up from the press conference and ran out and filed stories, and our telephone began to ring. I had calls from Washington, from the State Department, asking what this meant, from the head of the U.S. mission in West Berlin asking what this meant. And we talked about it at length and decided that, well, what it probably meant was that tomorrow morning, hundreds of thousands of East Germans would go to the police station in a very orderly way, would apply for passports, and within a day or two would start to travel. And we filed our telegrams. I got the last telegrams out about 10 o'clock at night. I was the last person in the embassy except for the communicator who had to actually send them. And I got in my car and started to drive home. And the embassy was in the center of East Berlin. We lived in the northern part of the city, and as I was on my way home, I got near the point where the wall was quite close. There was a crossing point about 500 to 1,000 yards off to my left, and the street was totally blocked by East Germans who were streaming in the direction of the wall, and the police trying to keep one narrow lane of traffic open. And frankly, I was quite concerned. I was frightened that after weeks of total discipline during this period of demonstrations that was growing into revolution, where everyone had kept discipline, no one had lost their temper, there had been no violence, no riots, no loss of life, certainly, that perhaps at this moment when it looked like free travel was in fact about to happen, that something terrible could go wrong, that a crowd of people moving toward the wall could frighten the guards who might not have orders, who might open fire. One person in the crowd might throw a stone. There could be a bloodbath, and the worst kinds of scenarios were imaginable. So I had to decide what to do, and I first thought I should stop the car and follow the crowd to the wall. And then I thought if I do that, I'll be cut off, and it's important to get word out of what's happening. So instead of doing that, I stayed in the car and got through the crowd with the help of the police, finished the drive home, ran up the stairs of the house, found that my wife had already gone to bed, woke her up and told her that I'd just seen this and I was quite concerned about it, and I'd better call Washington. Instead of calling Washington directly, I called the ambassador and started to tell him what I'd seen, and he began laughing and he said, John, turn on the television, you'll see that it's all over. The wall is open. Sure enough, we turned on the television, saw these remarkable scenes that you saw also back here in the United States, and after watching for a couple of minutes and in shocked silence, Gabi turned to me and said, do you think I should get dressed? Should we go down there? And what I said was, this is what somewhat embarrasses me, I said, gosh, I think we ought to simply go to sleep, because I don't think I'll get any more sleep for the next 2 or 3 days. I'll be so busy tomorrow. So that's the way I experienced that evening.
Well, that is quite a story. Did you ever think the possibility that Soviet Union or somebody might send tanks in?
Personally, I did, unless there was some terrible violence. I thought that Gorbachev had to be taken at his word that political solutions were the only solutions possible to the problems in Eastern Europe. Absent the kind of violence that fortunately never happened, I didn't think that the Soviet Union would intervene. That isn't to say that it wasn't something that a lot of people didn't worry about. People did worry about it. I simply personally believed that Gorbachev had already given sufficient evidence of how seriously he took his own statements about political reform in Eastern Europe by the way he'd reacted earlier in the year to the changes of government in Poland and Hungary.
Let's go to some more questions. We have just a few minutes left with Jonathan Greenwald, the author of Berlin Witness. He was a political consul at the U.S. Embassy in East Berlin from 1987 through 1990. He was right there when all of this was going on. Well, I think probably one of the most important questions that is being asked here by audience members is, who do you believe was ultimately responsible for initiating the fall of the wall? Now, when I just thinking about that question, you start thinking, was it Ronald Reagan? Was it George Bush? Was it the people themselves within Germany, both East and West? Who do you think was responsible?
Well, the heroes of the event, and I think they are heroes, were the East German people. They took their own fate into their hands. They acted boldly yet prudently, with a remarkable discipline and with a remarkable courage. And it was their revolution. In fact, if I have a regret about period, it's that they made such a remarkable revolution and so very quickly lost control of it. that gets us into a different question of how the unification process was carried out and what's happened over the last 10 years. Very quickly after the wall opened and after the communist government fell, essentially control of the political fate of Eastern Germany passed from the hands of East Germans to a well-meaning but not always fully wisely acting West German government. But for those days in October and November of 1989, clearly the actors, and they were heroic actors, were the East German people. Beyond that, I think one has to give enormous credit to Mikhail Gorbachev. I think he even symbolically sneezed well into November or December, even weeks after the wall had opened, had he given an indication that, in fact, in desperation to maintain a crumbling empire in Eastern Europe, he would do what you spoke of a few minutes ago, send tanks into the streets. I think the whole process would have come to a crashing halt. There very well likely could have been bloodshed. It could have been a terrible thing, but I think that the momentum toward German unification would have stopped because most East Germans, and I think most West Germans, felt there was a red line that couldn't be crossed toward German unification, that it was something that was simply too difficult for the Soviet Union to accept. And that's why I mentioned the November 4th demonstration on Alexanderplatz, where everything was demanded by the protesters except unification, because it was felt that this was something the Soviet Union couldn't accept. That Gorbachev, in fact, never backed down from his own commitment to letting politics and not force decide what was happening in Eastern Europe, even when a lot of his own calculations about what would happen proved to be wrong, I think is truly one of the most remarkable feats of statesmanship that we've seen. And so next to the East German people, I would say the hero of that time was Mikhail Gorbachev.
Well, do you feel that Ronald Reagan's declaration of the Soviet Union as an evil empire maybe hurt their feelings? I'm just being a little silly here, but we've got Ronald Reagan coming out making a statement that a lot of people thought was a bit extreme. Do you think it had an effect on anything that happened over there?
I would say less than is often
attributed. Okay,
that there was in fact a sickness within the system that had to be addressed, or it would eventually have destroyed the system. Gorbachev tried to address it and failed, but I think the need to address it wasn't because Ronald Reagan was making the statements or even applying the pressure he applied. And the failure was probably in the end partly a political failure of people making a few wrong choices at a few crucial moments, and partly the inherent weakness of the system. I would give honestly more credit to George Bush for extraordinarily skillful management of what was still a very tension-filled and sensitive and dangerous situation for months before and months after the Berlin Wall opened. That required serious statesmanship skills, and Bush deserves very high marks for that. Whether Reagan would have been as skillful, I don't know. He simply wasn't president at the time. But I would say in terms of how it all came out, that it came out as well as it came out, we owe more to George Bush than to Ronald Reagan.
Did you ever personally deal with or meet Erich Honecker?
I met him a number of times, not as the main interlocutor for him. I met him while accompanying my ambassador to meetings and accompanying senior visitors from Washington. The Deputy Secretary of State visited several times and had meetings with Honecker each time he visited. So I met him 5 or 6 times, shook his hand at each meeting, took notes at the meetings, formed some impressions, but other than the ritual day, sir, and goodbye, sir, I didn't exchange personal words with him.
Do you feel that it was right for the Germans to have let him go, or should he have gone on trial as the man responsible for the deaths of innocent people trying to escape to the West?
That's a difficult question. My answer may seem a little controversial to you. I think it was a mistake to have started the trial of Honecker. I'm glad that the trial wasn't continued, that he was able to live out his life in effect in exile as a dying man, dying of cancer in Chile. For a political figure, the kind of defeat he suffered by being rejected totally, first by his party and then by the people and then by history, is the most painful penalty that one can suffer. And the political trial, because it had to seem to him as a political trial, for his actions as as a head of state, head of government, really probably only to him seemed proof of what he felt all along, that it was just a matter of an internal civil war between the East German and the West German systems. I think, frankly, the harsher penalty would have been, as it was, for him to be treated as historical irrelevancy, rejected by the people and rejected by history.
Just a few minutes left, 5 minutes left here with our guest, Jonathan Greenwald. We certainly have obtained a lot of great information from our guests today as we talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall 10 years ago on Stein Online with Eliot Stein. And, of course, if you have friends who are interested in this topic, this show will be archived later tonight, as all of ours are, from the last 90 days or so. Did you ever intervene in any situations whereby, for example, you had people in East Germany that had relatives in West Germany, maybe somebody was ill on either side, and the East Germans were saying, sorry, can't go, or sorry, can't come in? Did you ever intervene and say, look, come on, you've got to show some humanitarianism here and let these people see each other?
We as Americans didn't have that problem. This was the kind of problem that had to be dealt with by the West German mission in East Berlin all of the time. But there were relatively few humanitarian problems between Americans and East Germany of that sort. And when they came up, the East Germans were actually quite good at resolving them. Ours were just a drop in the bucket, of course, compared to the numbers of cases that the West Germans had. The closest analogy to that I encountered was during that very, very difficult period in the days leading up to the fall of Honecker in October of 1989, when tension in East Berlin at times was so thick that you could literally felt you could cut it with a knife.
Yes.
And at one point, the East Germans closed off the border between East Germany and Czechoslovakia because they didn't want more East Germans going to Prague to try to camp out in the West German embassy. And a train load was sent back from the border the day that the border was closed, and about 2 or 3 families, 12 or 15 people in those families, decided that rather than go back to their homes after having been turned back from the border, they would come to the American embassy and try to sit in at the embassy until they got permission to leave the country. Half of them got in the door before the Marines realized what was happening. They closed the doors. Their instructions told them to do it because we weren't able to accommodate sit-ins and hope we wouldn't have the kind of situation the West German embassy had. I was the senior person in the embassy at that moment because it was lunch hour and the ambassador was away. And the Marines asked me what they should do because half of the families were outside and half of them were inside, and the families were actually divided. The children, in some cases, were outside the door and the mothers were inside. I had to make a decision at that moment, and I still am very happy and proud I made the decision I did, which was to say, open the door, we have to let them in. We can't leave half the families out there to be picked up by the police. It would be terrible. So we had 3 families sitting in the embassy for most of that week, and we had to go to the East German government with the help of a lawyer who was rather famous for having arranged lots of spy exchanges in his days, a man named Vogel. And eventually we were able to negotiate permission for those families to return home and then immediately get permission to go to West Germany as they wanted.
I'm going to hold the last question here from an audience member for you, as it asks, and it says this, of course, metaphorically. It says, are we going to see any of the other walls coming down?
Well, the wall that most matters in Germany today is what many people refer to when they say that the most difficult wall is the wall in our minds between Eastern and Western Germany. And that goes to the 40-plus years of different experiences that they've had under different systems. And still 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there are great differences that have to be bridged to complete the unification process. It will be completed successfully. It's simply turned out to be much more difficult than we expected. Elsewhere in the world, I'm sure we'll see the same kind of spirit that animated the East German Revolution in different circumstances, coming out in different ways, but in many ways with the same result, that people who are determined to have a better life, determined to achieve freedom, will find ways to accomplish that, and I think that will happen elsewhere. Elliot, you've been very kind in giving a plug to my book. I just have to make one extra plug if I could.
Sure thing.
To say that last year, after leaving the Foreign Service, I had the pleasure of teaching at Florence University in Wisconsin, and I attempted to relive the experience by teaching a course on the diplomacy of 1989, revolution and diplomacy, trying to see if I could understand what happened in East Germany any better with a perspective of 9 years than I did as it was happening and the whirlwind was passing around me. I still, 9 years after and now 10 years after, still amazed at what happened. I don't pretend to fully understand it. It was the most remarkable experience of my life. And it does leave one with a feeling of awe for the human spirit that at certain times can rise up and produce remarkable results. And it was certainly a remarkable result that I witnessed and had a chance to play a very, very small part in, be a part of in East Berlin. And I thank you very much for giving me the chance to relive it again this evening.
Certainly. Thank you, John. Hang on a minute, please, if you would. Jonathan Greenwald, Berlin Witness, an American Diplomat's Chronicle of East Germany's Revolution. Pick it up at bookstores. Thank you, everybody. Be sure to check on a regular basis for the postings of brand new Stein Online shows with Eliot Stein at www.steinonline.com, STEIN.